Rich Burke, a statewide DAP specialist for the Minnesota Low Incidence Projects through the Minnesota Department of Education. I'm here to do a session on due process questions and answers for the 45th annual Minnesota DAPE conference. I'm very excited that this year we're able to do our conference online format rather than not have a conference at all. Hopefully next year we'll be back together at camp for our 46th annual. I look forward to that, but we'll do a good job this year. Thank you to our conference chairs, both Ann and Sue. They've done a great job preparing. So on to our session. A couple questions that have been really at the forefront with emails and calls this fall are doing evaluations when you have limited or no access to students due to distance learning or hybrid learning. And then a number of questions have come up due working with caseloads and workloads and things like that. So those are the two topics that I'll start with, and then we'll go on from there. We're going to start, as you can see on the screen, Minnesota Rule 3525-1352 is really the rule or law that governs how students qualify for adapted physical education. And it is virtually the same law. It's been for 25 plus years, reminding we as DAPE teachers how students qualify and how we document that qualification. If you look at subpart 2, the criteria that's on the screen, a student has to have one of the following categorical disabilities. Their numbers are listed, Minnesota rule there, but they're also listed out: autism spectrum disorders, deaf, blind, emotional behavior disorders, deaf, hard of hearing, specific learning disabilities, developmental cognitive disabilities, severely multi-impaired, other health disabilities, physical impairment, visual impairment, traumatic brain injury, and the last one there is a numerical reference, 3525.1351. That is the section of Minnesota rule that is early childhood special education. So although early childhood isn't listed in those, and sometimes there's a lot of problems around that because it's listed by number, not by name. People think that we don't serve students in early childhood, but we do. And so if you have somebody who says that well, it's not part of the criteria, yes, it is. In Minnesota Rule 3525-1351 is the early childhood, and we can take a look at that. I'll bring that up on the screen later on in the presentation. But all of these numerical references are on the MnDape .org website under laws, and that you have those if you need that for reference. But getting back to the first category of the evaluations during our present school climate, distance learning or hybrid learning, or limited access to students. There are two ways students can qualify for DAPE services. The first one is under section B there, B1, the student's performance on an appropriate selected technically adequate norm referenced psychomotor or physical fitness measurement is 1.5 standard deviations or below or more below the mean. The instrument must be administered by an appropriate licensed teacher. So that's you. Gen Ed PE teacher that doesn't have a DAPE license cannot administer those license or those tests, as well as another motor team member, OT or PT. It's not appropriately licensed. The appropriate license to administer those is a DAPE licensure. So that's what that means. So when we talk about standardized tests, the one that I think is most common out there is the test of gross motor development. Now, the third edition. For years we had TGMD 2. Now it's 3. those tests are look at areas in locomotor skills as well as some object control, things like throwing, catching, striking, kicking, those kinds of tasks. That also relate very well to our Minnesota state standards, which is nice. The thing about that is, if you look at the test protocol, a person has to be in direct observation of that student performing those things to validate or to have that test be validated. So when you are no access or limited access, it makes it very hard to use that to qualify a student. That 1.5 standard deviations, which also relates to when you finish scoring the test, that 7.5 percentile or below. Just remember that anytime it's listed 1.5 standard deviations, if you look at the bell curve, that refers to the 7.5 percentile or below on any standardized test. That's our cutoff criteria. It's just listed in SD, standard deviation language, rather than percentile language. And the second area, which those of you have seen some of my assessment and due processing kinds of sessions before, I think you can create a much better snapshot in time of the student is B2. And that's the student's pupil's development or achievement and independence in school, home, and community settings is inadequate to allow the pupil to succeed in regular physical education as supported by written documentation from 2 or more of the following, and they include motor and skills checklist, informal tests, criterion reference measures, deficits in achievement related to the defined curriculum, which is our Minnesota state standards, medical history or reports, parent or staff interviews. Medical history can be very important for certain kinds of disabilities. We'll talk about that in a minute. Parent and staff interviews, systematic observations, actually seeing the student participate in different activities, social, emotional, and behavioral assessments. So what you want to do with that B2 section is you want to look at the student's learner attributes and maybe look at their category of disability or their areas of need, and you want to pick the tools that help you best create strengths and needs in the areas of their learning. So if you have a student, let's say, who has physical disabilities or health impairments, you'd probably want to pick for your 2 or more, you'd want to use medical history reports because you'd want to bring in that medical aspect of those reports so that we know what kinds of things a student can or can't do. Certain conditions have things that are counterindicated that the student shouldn't be doing in any kind of physical setting, including physical education. So you want to make sure that you're aware of those. And then another place to get information for a student with, say, physical disabilities would be parent and staff interviews. The parents can have a lot of information to share. They know that medical history. They know everything related to that student, where their development has been in the past, previous hospital kinds of things, other kinds of information that are very critical for us now. And staff interviews, you could use the school nurse to help interpret those medical history reports, and that would be a very good use of that. So parent and staff interviews, criterion checklists. When you use the TGMD2 or 3 and you're not able to do that in person, you might be able to have that parent script some of those items from the TGMD2 or 3, overhand throw, locomotor kind of skills, and videotape that for you or another member of the team that, maybe your district is sending in one person to a home setting, or they're bringing in the student and allowing one person from your team to do that assessment. You could use a script and have that session videotaped so that you can document that student's participation, or their performance, I should say, on those kinds of locomotor tasks. It could be something that you've developed from the state standards, also in kind of a motor skills checklist that are related to the defined curriculum, the standards. And but because you're not there in person to do the observation, you can't use it as a part B1, but you can use it in part B2 as a criterion reference measure. And you can document from there. You can look at the student's performance and use your professional judgment on where that student is based on the criteria from the TGM-D2, or based on the criteria in your state standards, to give an estimation of age appropriateness or grade level participation. And so in that case, that would be one of the 2 or more required. But if a student has, in the categorical disability areas of, say, social EBD or autism spectrum disorders, you want to make sure that you're using tools that you look at those student needs in those areas. You don't want to do just motor kinds of tasks with a student with those 2 categorical disabilities, because it's they could be a student who does really great on those kinds of physical tasks, but when they're put into a physical education class with classroom peers or other students, their participation, because of their needs with communication or with behavioral, though emotional kinds of things, social participation, it's going to be very difficult for them to be successful in that Gen Ed PE class. And so you wouldn't use motor skill checklist to help document that student's participation and their needs. You would want to use more emotional, social, and behavioral kinds of assessments. And those you can use other information that's been gleaned by other EBD teachers, school psychologists, social worker, those kinds of things. They've already documented a lot of the EBD, the social emotional behavior kinds of information, and you can use that information in your report to document that those kinds of learner attributes can make it difficult for a student to be successful in that regular physical education program. A student with cognitive disabilities, you'd want to make sure that you're documenting the achievement related to the defined curriculum in physical education in our state standards. There are a number of academic kinds of other academic area things that are required for a student to be successful. Certain written projects, developing health plans, being able to do written tests to demonstrate success in certain areas in physical education. All of those things are going to could be very hard for a student with developmental cognitive disabilities. And so you'd want to use some kind of staff interview or other kinds of documentation that documents those needs, because again, just a physical or motor skills checklist alone is not going to have a student's true ability and be able to document their needs. And it might look like the student could be successful, but we know because those areas are very critical for successful participation, it's going to make their successful participation very, very hard. And so you need to document in those areas when you develop those tests. So when you are doing this limited access or no access to students, you're going to have to use those items that you can do with not seeing face to face, not being able to do that with the students. So you're going to pick those items like a parent or staff interview, observation, video observations where other people have done that. You're going to maybe present them, like I said earlier, with some kind of a scripted, so that you're asking them to have the student do certain activities, whether it's running or galloping, those locomotor kind of things, or if it's an overhand throw and catch with another parent or a peer. Those are the kinds of things that you want to have to create that good snapshot in time of where that student is. Not having or having limited access or no access to a student makes it more difficult to do an assessment, but it doesn't mean that we can't do a good assessment for a student. And we just have to use those items from B2 that are very easily adaptable to not being done in person or that limited access. The one thing, especially for first-time assessments or a second triennial assessment, I still like to use those parent interviews. I can make a little script and ask parents questions like what kinds of activities the student likes to do on their time, physical activities we're talking about. Would they rather spend their time inside? And when we find out things that they're into video games and they don't do a lot of physical activities, that can help us explain the needs that student has to become a more physically active learner. And so when you do those parent interviews, you can ask maybe what the parents do for recreation. Does a student, do you go on family bike rides or family walks, or are you active in the yard doing, basketball or throwing a ball or playing soccer, any of those things? That's all kinds of things that you can ask a parent in a parent interview. And that is very valuable information that you can compare towards the grade level standards, or an early childhood case when you look at the early childhood learner outcomes that are help you write that appropriate report. So the next thing that you have to do then, and that becomes the big critical part, is how you write up those B2 measures when you use two or more of those. And you just have to be very factual. It's very good to relate that information that you've gleaned from those two or more items and relate them back to standards, whether grade level outcomes. It's, if a student is two or more grade levels behind, I think that we can make a really good case for that student having needs that qualify for DAPE services in your report. And so the nice thing about if you've used that parent interview is that you have some of that information from the parents, and they can be in agreement and be a partner, an ally in determining that student has needs and should qualify for DAPE service. And remember, once a student qualifies for DAPE service, and the assessment has determined the needs, then it's up to you and the other team members and the parents to determine what level of service it best serves and best meets those needs. Just because they qualify for DAPE service doesn't mean that they need direct one-to-one kinds of service. There's a whole continuum of service, from direct small group one-to-one kinds of instruction all the way to larger group pull-out, to push-in services where the DAPE teacher goes in and is part of the general physical education setting. where you collaborate with the gen ed teacher, kind of in a team taught model. And also, there are times when just having paraprofessional or educational assistant support is what that student would need to be successful in gen ed PE to meet those needs, your IEP goals and objectives. So in that case, you're really working with the special education staff, the case manager and the paraprofessionals on making sure that the supports are in that IEP so that that student can be successful in the gen ed setting. I think that the longer I taught, the numbers of students that I had in more of an indirect kind of service model increased every year, because when we looked at the state standards and how much actual support a student needed to work towards those grade level standards and outcomes, wasn't as much as we thought. And when you get your kind of self in that realization that it's about the student needs and how we meet those needs, it's not about service delivery and what makes it easier for me. You can go to the team and talk about those, and sometimes the indirect model is better service for the student than the direct model. So that's kind of those due process things. Again, just because a student qualifies for DAPE service and you've determined that via the assessment with that student, and you've qualified them and you've identified the needs, now you have to determine what level of service meets that student's needs as far as whether an more inclusive setting within the gen ed PE with support, team teaching, or larger group. Maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe the student does need some smaller group pullout to strengthen up certain skills, but they also need to participate in that gen ed PE class, so they have a kind of a combined service level on their IEP. Those are kind of questions that we talk about all the time, but again, that it all goes back to 3525-1352, our state criteria, and it really is about making sure that you document the need. The evidence comes from the B1 or the B2 tools that we've talked about. Remember that the student has to have a categorical disability. So before I forget, we're going to go on to that 3525-1351. I wanted to show you the early childhood criteria. So I'm going to go to my presentation folder here, and we're going to find 3525-1351. We'll pull that up on the screen. We'll make it a little bit bigger here so you can see it. And so if you look at that, it really does talk about early intervention, ages 3 through 6. That's early childhood special education services. So if a student qualifies for early childhood services and you determine that they are going to need support in a gen ed PE setting, and that's the question sometimes that come up because they don't have early childhood services PE a lot of times. But remember, the whole theory of early childhood special education is you give students support in the areas of needs, so that later on, when they get to elementary school, kindergarten, first grade, third grade, they don't need as much support later because you've helped give them skills at an early childhood level in their development that you give those kinds of things. So anyway, that 3525-1351, even though early childhood special ed is not listed in that criteria in the DAPE criteria, that that is the numerical reference for early childhood special ed, so that you know that that is in there, and we can serve and should serve students who qualify in early childhood, ages 3 through 6. It does not mean that we serve birth to 2 students. That's not part of our training. It's not part of our license. We are 3 through 6, but we can and should serve those students when they meet that early childhood special ed, early intervention service, and they also meet the DAPE criteria. So that's that. And remember, these are always on the minnesotaDAPE.org website. The next thing that I wanted to look at just quickly before we move on with due process kind of things. This is on the DAPE. It'll also website. It'll also be in our. I'll put it on the resources for this session. But if you look at the 35.25.28.10, it is the development of an IEP. And in there, it gives all the things that a team must do to make sure that they are doing the guaranteeing the students' due process. And so when it talks about an IEP, it talks about what needs to be included in an IEP. When you do the assessment, not only are you looking for a student's qualification for DAPE, but you're looking for their areas of need. And so when you write up that evaluation, in that evaluation you're going to list the areas of needs, and from those areas of need, that creates the present, within that creates the present level of education performance, as you see under A1 there. And then from A1, you need to develop from those needs, from the present level of performance, you need to write annual measurable goals and objectives. And the nice thing about our Minnesota standards, they're written they relate very well to the benchmarks and objectives. If you look at the state standards as being a goal area in the 5 standards, if you look at the benchmarks, they really help you determine the short-term objectives. So if you are doing the IEP, make sure that you're looking at the student's needs and then how that relates to the needs and then to the state standards. So when we I'm pulling up on my other screen here the new state standards. It really does help us get towards those writing up standards-based goals and objectives. That's kind of where I was going for. So from there, and remember, because we Minnesota DAPE criteria has a state requirement in our 35.25.13.52. We have state mandated criteria how students qualify. That's what makes us a special education service, not a related service. If you look at related services like OTs and PTs, music therapists, those kinds of things, they don't have a state mandated criteria. They don't have a rule like we have that students qualify. The determination of how that student receives services in those areas is done by the team. They use qualification tests and things like that, but it really is about where the team thinks that student is, not as required by like a Minnesota Rule 35.25.13.52 in our case. So the extent of the student participating in a typical gen ed setting, or if they're going to be in pull-out kinds of classes, Everything is laid out in this 35, 25, 28, 10. And so if you have questions about where your part is on a special education team, this is a really good uh, place to go and for clarification and making sure your team is, so to speak, playing by the rules, not just trying to come up with what they think is going to work for the student. It really is based on rule and law, and if you look at the IEP team shall, in the case of a pupil whose behavior, so that sometimes they develop strategies, including positive behavior interventions and supports. So those are the students that we work with too. I wanted to bring that out. It's not just the students with that can't do the physical education skills that qualify for adapted PE. It's about students with behavioral or cognitive or communication needs or social needs, that their needs make it very difficult for them to be successful in that Gen Ed PE class. Those are the kinds of things that we need to document in an IEP, whether they need certain kinds of technologies, say a student who is blind or low vision, or a student who is deaf or hard of hearing. All of those kinds of accommodations and modifications that you need to help them be successful in adapted PE also need to be documented in the IEP, so that student receives that free and appropriate public education. Those are what it's about. So I wanted to show you this 3525 28.10, and I will have that in the resources part of on the Sketch app, so you can refer to that. And it is, but remember, it's Minnesota rule. It is the law that governs special education services in Minnesota. So, looking at the next thing that I get a lot of questions every late summer and early fall about caseload, because we all know that as districts come back to school, sometimes they're in that saving mode where they want to save some money. They want to make sure that they're efficiently spending money, and they look at numbers and they don't look at needs. Sometimes they don't look at IEPs, and they just kind of seem to be making unilateral decisions for how the numbers of students you serve and how they're going to serve them. And remember, any time that you change a student level of service or minutes of service, that has to be done by a team parent meeting. You cannot just unilaterally cut services. That has to be agreed to by the parent and signed off, just like any change in an IEP. So just that's why I brought up that 35, 25, 28.10, so that you had that documentation of the requirements for due process. But if you look at caseloads, and the only revisor or rule that talks about caseloads in Minnesota doesn't really relate. It doesn't have any language in here about DAPE services, but what it does have in here is the kinds of different categorical disabilities and how many students, teachers, and staff are required to the maximum number of students or minimum number of staff sometimes. And so if you look at that, for students who receive direct special instruction from a teacher more than 60% of the instructional day, but less than a full day, and it lists some of those kinds of categorical disabilities. And it says here that for certain deaf, blind, autism, spectrum disorders, developmental cognitive disabilities, severe, profound, or severely multiply impaired, it's 3 pupils in that group. In the next one, it's 6 pupils, 12 pupils, 15 pupils. So if you look at that, and those are the kinds of students you're serving, it would uh, make sense then that you shouldn't have groups bigger than these guidelines in your DAPE groups. It doesn't mean anything for your total number of students that you have on your caseload or your service load, but it kind of should help you form what successful groupings you might have for different students. If an administrator wants to put or wants you to pair, 10 kids with severe, profound kinds of disabilities in a DAPE class, it kind of stands to reason that if you look at the other criteria that says no more than 6 pupils, that you're going to have some problems with that number of students in your class, and although it's not a requirement in DAPE, if you look at, like I said, the categorical disability and the recommendations for case managers and teachers in the other parts of the team, it would stand to reason that that should also be followed in adapted PE also. So then it says here mild to moderate range and different kinds of with one paraprofessional up to 15 students. All other disabilities with one paraprofessional, 10 students. So if you read through this, and again, like I said, I'll have the reference in the items for the session. You can kind of take a look at that, and it just gives you some information to use with your teams. Here's caseloads for early childhood programs. Birth through 2 years we don't worry about, but 3 through 6, 16 pupils per teacher. It kind of gives you some guidelines, that if that works for the early childhood special education classroom, then that should probably be the maybe pretty good guidelines for your DAPE classes also. The other thing that I wanted to mention was on that, if you're in a classroom, some things that can affect that too are you can probably have more students in your class if you have sometimes more paraprofessional assistants. But remember, and people who help you develop your schedule are going to have to remember that it really does mean that you're going to have sometimes when your numbers go up, that you're going to have more paraprofessionals to be successful. And it also means you're going to have some more time to work with those paraprofessionals without the students, so that your class is going to be successful also. So it is. But when it comes to total numbers of students on your caseload, there isn't guidelines, from on the Minnesota rules and statutes that has a maximum number. I think when you the only way to really approach that, it becomes a union kind of thing, and you need to talk with your building and district union folks, because when you get to a certain point, we all have that idea in our head, whether it's 40 or 50 or 60 or whatever direct kinds of or indirect students on your caseload becomes too much. I think you can make a case with your union folks that you either need to be working on an overload where you're receiving a little more compensation for your extra time, or your number of students on your caseloads needs to be looked at, and more staff needs to be provided. But the hard thing about that, again, as I said before, there is no Minnesota rule that says in a DAPE setting, this is the maximum number or total number of students that you have to make to be successful in your workloads, your caseloads. The other things that need to be considered in there is your travel time, your due process time, writing IEPs, doing documentation for present levels of performance, assessments, certainly, all of those things you need to document so that you have that data so that when you go in and you talk with your supervisor, with your special ed director, that you can help them understand really what the job entails so that you have data to support your position. It doesn't become just a narrative between you and the director or you and the coordinator. So that is, I think a big thing to have is that data. It also helps if you have other members on your special ed teams in your buildings that can help support you too. And as far as the number of students, if you're seeing more students in a group than what they typically see in the same groups, if they're, say, you're combining the students from two different DCD teachers into one PE class, they wouldn't be expected to work under those conditions. Maybe that's the data that you need to share with your people too. So that's all kind of goes into the whole planning with that. But documentation and looking at the numbers of students that you have in your DAPE setting, and what you need, what kinds of support you need to be successful. So, and kind of coming to the end of this session, I wanted to give some examples of things that you could use in some of those. I'll put this in the resources too. Here's an example of a parent interview that I used when I was in still teaching in Mountain View, and it is I just called it a parent interview script and questions. State the reason of your call, remind the parents that you're part of the team that's doing the initial or 3-year evaluation plan. They signed off that you were going to be part of that team, and just to kind of refresh their memory. And you're looking at their child's participation in physical education as it relates to gross motor ability and Minnesota PE standards. And so here are some of the questions that I would ask on the phone. What kinds of activities does your child like to do in their non-school time? What kinds of activities has your child participated in the past? Maybe they were in a soccer team or something in the community. Are there any recreational activities that you participate in the family? Oh, yes, Mr. Burke, we have a lake place, and when we go to the lake, we like to do water swimming and tubing and things like that. And so it's good to document all of those kinds of things. What kinds of activities would you like to see your child participate in the future? That is really a kind of a nice question to ask parents, because they have some dreams. They have some ideas of what the lifetime kinds of rec leisure activities they'd like to see their child participate. Some parents would just say they want their students, their sons or daughters, to be healthy, active learners, and they want to make sure that they're moving so that they become better students. That's a very valid thing that you want to listen to. Do you feel your child has any specific needs in physical education activities? And in that, they might share those physical limitations we talked about in the criteria. They might share some emotional kinds of stuff. Who knows, they might share issues that they have with other students. That's really open-ended question, and it's just sometimes good to know. They might share some things about the gen ed PE teacher, and just remember, when you're talking about that, it's you're gaining information to help support the needs of the student, and whether they qualify for DAPE or not, but you're not trying to do an I gotcha to another member of the team. You're just using that information to help you determine that student's needs. And so let's see, the other one that um, my colleagues in Mound View, we used a DAPE inventory. I've showed this to other people, and it was that kind of checklist kind of thing that gave us some uh, information, some data that we could use. And we talked about physical fitness, we talked about gross motor skills, we talked about transition to and from physical education, because we all know that's a big piece of PE. Responding to teacher, relating to peers and equipment, effort and self-acceptance, and cognitive abilities, certainly emotional kinds of things. These are all areas that relate to the Minnesota PE standards. And by being able to document those in a checklist, that helps you with that, like I said, that snapshot in time that is so crucial to having being able to come up with that B2 kinds of assessments. So there are some really nice things that I will also put on there that you've probably seen in your district already about planning during COVID times and things. I'll put some of those in my information, and you can ask questions too. Email me. My email address is on the website always, but I'll give it here now too. It's richbmn DAPE. I should start over again. RICHBMNDAPE @gmail.com. Here's another one that I developed. So some talking points for for administrators or parents. These are all things that you can. It's just information that you can use to help you with due process kinds of things. I put in here the eligibility criteria 35, 25, 13, 52. I've got the website information where that's always there. I talked about in the presentation today about the Minnesota rule and 1351, how that early childhood intervention services ages 3 to 5 are not listed as a name. Talk on our website. The operational guide always has some good helping kinds of thoughts. We're doing a revision to work on that and the standards as they really become available. I think one of the things that I'm putting forward at the Department of Ed is that I think I would recommend that people would write standards-based goals and objectives that they need. That's how we really need to be thinking about our service in adaptive PE, is working towards Gen Ed, Minnesota PE standards. The standards and benchmarks are a really good way for us as DAPE teachers to help narrow down how we serve students and what is important and what really is kind of fluff. And in there, I listed also here you got all of the different licensure programs and just some other information. The one thing that is not listed in state, because it's not a categorical disability. We are a special education service, not a related service, like I've said, but we are not a categorical disability. So students, we don't get to pull numbers of students in Minnesota, which is and then again some of this, and I see that I didn't update my information, so I'll make sure that again my website, since I've my email address since I've retired, is richbmndape @gmail.com. So I want to in conclusion, remind you that we're going to have a chance for some more Q&A on the Sedge app, and you can either that or contact me through my email. Thank you very much, and I hope that the rest of your conference goes well. And I appreciate all the work that Ann and Sue as conference chairs this year, and all the members of the Minnesota DAPE Leadership Committee do on behalf of DAPE teachers across the state, whether it's a region rep or in your regions, or if it's the members at large. I think our Minnesota DAPE Leadership Committee deserves a big pat on the back and a round of applause for everything that they do. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you next year at number 46.